Kristen, so much for that introduction, and welcome everybody. Really excited to have you here tonight. I think this is going to be a really great discussion and a really important topic for us to discuss this evening. A little bit more about me that I wanted to share. As Kristen said, my name is Sam Drazin. I am a former elementary educator and a former elementary educator. Sorry, just trying to get the video right. Former elementary educator and a nationally recognized school presenter. I present to students, parents, teachers, you name it in a school system, I've presented. About 7.5 years ago, I left the classroom and started an organization called Changing Perspectives. And I also live with my own facial difference and conductive hearing loss as my disability. I really hope that this conversation tonight is not the end, but just the beginning. So I've put my email address here, up here on the slide, and you're more than welcome to reach out to me or through the following social media platforms. A little bit more about Changing Perspectives. We are a 501c3 educational nonprofit organization. And our work really focuses around forming partnerships with schools and other organizations to promote social emotional learning in an effort to cultivate more inclusive and equitable learning communities with a focus and lens on students with disabilities. We do our work through providing curriculum resources to educators pre-K through high school, through educator professional development trainings, as well as parent programs like this one this evening. Our website is here on the screen, and I also invite and encourage you to follow us on social media. As Kristen said, over the last couple of years, we've had the honor of partnering with Dedication to Special Education in a variety of capacities. And this year, this Marin County Inclusion Inspiration Series is really an opportunity for ongoing education, empowerment, inspiration, and engagement within what is inclusion and how can we collectively move Marin County forward when it comes to inclusion, especially inclusion of students with disabilities. I'm going to dedicate some time at the end of tonight's presentation for questions, but I also invite you to drop any questions, comments, thoughts that you might have during this presentation into the chat, and we will have someone monitor the chat throughout this evening. So let's jump into the meat of tonight's presentation. Tonight's presentation is really focused on unpacking, defining, potentially redefining for some of us, two terms that for some of us might be new and for some of us we might be already well versed in. We're going to talk a little bit about this concept of neurodiversity. It's something that we're hearing more and more about these days. So we'll talk about what is neurodiversity, why is it important. The next topic we're going to address this evening is the idea of ableism and ableistic perspective. And then lastly, we'll kind of bring this together by talking about what is the role that the term neurodiversity and the concepts related to neurodiversity, what is the role of ableism and ableistic perspective in society, and how can these terms help drive inclusion forward rather than hold us back in more of a segregated, exclusive model. So what is neurodiversity? What I'd like to do right now is just pose that question to you as participants. So if you feel comfortable, I'm going to ask that you pop into the chat, what is your definition of neurodiversity, or what do you think neurodiversity means? I'm just going to go silent for a moment and let everyone have a chance to participate in that way. Thank you for that first response. Oh, here they come. I knew once we had one, others would participate. So already in the chat, I'm noticing that folks are exploring this term of neurodiversity by thinking about neuro related to our brain, diversity in terms of what it means to be diverse, how we learn, variations. These are great. Keep them coming. So I wanted to first kind of just unpack the word, right? Neuro diversity. So when we think of the word or the term neuro, we often think about the way we think, the way our brain is wired, the way one might perceive the world, right? And when we think about diversity, we think about different types of people, whether that's race, whether that's age, whether that's gender, socioeconomic, whatever it might be. So if we take the idea of neuro, the way our brain works, we add it to diversity, kind of a variety of people. When we think about the term neurodiversity, we are thinking about the diversity of the way that people think. So to jump into that and unpack that a little bit more, I want to share with you a video that answers the question, what is neurodiversity?
Just like our fingerprints, all our brains are unique. But for the majority of people, their brains are similar enough that there are largely no obvious differences in how they function. They have differences in things like skills, preferences, and styles. But mostly, their brains mean they perceive the world in the same way. But for others, their brains are more fundamentally different. They have differences in things like social understanding, sensory processing, communication, and information processing. These differences are a result of neurological differences, such as autism, ADHD, dyslexia, and more. This natural variation in our brains is called neurodiversity. Those of us with no neurological conditions are neurotypical, and those of us with neurological conditions are neurodivergent. Neurodivergent people think differently. Their unique perspectives and experiences mean they can often excel at creativity and innovation, have highly specialized skill sets, and an ability to hyperfocus. If embraced, this can be a huge advantage to organizations and society. However, the differences neurodivergent people experience can make life challenging. In order to thrive at work, they often need some simple accommodations. For example, a sensory calm environment to recharge in, or a routine with the same start and end times. Approximately 1 in 7 people are neurodivergent. So not only is embracing neurodiversity critical for a truly inclusive organization, but it also presents organizations with a huge opportunity.
So what I liked about that video, obviously it's from England, but what I liked about that video is it's just a great simple illustration of kind of comparing the idea of someone who might be neurodiverse compared to someone who may be neurotypical. And when we really break down that language, it helps us really kind of consider what is the difference between neurodiversity and what someone might be considered as neurotypical.
just like our...
So when we think about disability, we often kind of are conditioned to believe that disability is a negative, right? It's an inability to perhaps do something or do something in a way that we are maybe conditioned or expected or believe that we should do something. And so we have to be really mindful that for some folks, when they hear the word neurodiversity or neurodiverse, that they perceive that as a deficit. And that in fact, being neurodiverse or being a part of the neurodiversity community is not a deficit, but actually lends itself to huge numbers of opportunity, perspective, and different ways that someone who might be neurodiverse can approach a problem or engage with a situation that someone who's neurotypical might not. So in the video, they talked about a few specific conditions or diagnosis, or what we might consider labels that might put someone into a category of being an individual that might be considered neurodiverse. And there's lots and lots of different categories or labels. I've put some up here on the board. One of the things that I think is important to consider is sometimes we tend to ignore labels or not want to label. But there are times and instances where labels can be truly empowering, right? It can give an individual a greater sense of identity. It can help them perhaps better understand what their strengths are and what are some things that are maybe a little challenging for them. It can really empower them to not view their neurodiversity as, again, a deficit, but really help them view their neurodiversity as something that should be celebrated, something that they can engage with, and something that they feel passionate and excited about. So up here on the screen, you'll notice there's a whole variety of different conditions. So things like ADHD to specific learning disabilities like dyscalculia, dyslexia. But we've also put mental health here on the board. And mental health conditions can also be an example of a neurodiverse individual. Individuals who may live on the autism spectrum, developmental delays, perhaps a traumatic brain injury, right? And in that video said, I think it was 1 in 7 or something like that was the statistic of individuals who may be classified as neurodiverse. So neurodiversity is not something that we should shy away from, and it's not something that we should have blinders on that doesn't exist, but rather be aware of the amount of neurodiversity in our world and look for ways that we can create a society that is inclusive, accepting, and empowering of the neurodiverse community. So when we think about neurodiversity and we think about neurodiversity kind of within societies and kind of the fabric of our societies, and this is the Marin County Inclusion Inspiration Series, right? So the objective here is to inspire a more inclusive Marin County for students and individuals with disabilities. And so when we think of neurodiversity, there's a couple schools of thought here. There's 2 models that we can kind of have our mindset in. One model is called the medical model, and the other model is called the social model. When we think about the medical model, what will the perspective of the medical model is that we as society view disability as a deficit, right? Again, I mentioned this earlier, that if we view disability as a deficit, it means that an individual with a disability has something that is quote unquote wrong with them that needs fixing, right? The medical model is about cure and treatment and fixing. When we kind of approach this type of work from the medical model, it often cultivates a sense of shame or pity for those with disabilities. And so when we create that, we move away from the idea of empowering and celebrating neurodiversity to individuals wanting to kind of disguise themselves to not be neurodiverse, to not be out in the community, to not be fully participatory. With the medical model, it's also kind of this idea of an individual with a disability needs fixing, right? We're focused on what is that deficit, what is that problem, and how can we fix it? It oftentimes also views individuals with disabilities as a problem, right? Our society isn't really set up for them. They're coming in, they're a problem. We need to fix them to make them fit into society, or we're going to fix them with a cure or a treatment. So that's a little bit about the medical model. Now, I know we're all on this call for the same reason, because we're motivated to create a more inclusive environment. So you could probably guess what the social model is, which is kind of polar opposite to the medical model. So the social model of disability is that rather than the medical model, which is about changing the person with the disability to fit into society, we're looking at the structures of society and we're thinking about what are ways that we can make tweaks to make our structures more inclusive and accessible for those with disabilities. When we do that, we consider how society kind of inherently limits people with disabilities in order for their ability to fully participate and access components of their world. And in doing so, we also begin to recognize the social barriers that are there that limit the interactions for people with disabilities. So again, when we think about neurodiversity and kind of that concept and how that concept plays into creating a more inclusive or creating more exclusive society, we can really start to unpack our mindset, our perspectives, and the mindset and perspectives of others into whether people are thinking about this from more of a medical model perspective, or people are thinking about it from more of a social model perspective. I'm just going to pause there for a second and look at the chat and just see if there's any questions or comments at this point. All right. So we've already spent the first half of this evening's presentation talking about the concepts of neurodiversity. And what is neurodiversity? How can it be viewed as a benefit rather than a deficit? And how can sometimes neurodiversity play into this idea of a medical model or a social model? Now, what I'd like to do is switch gears and talk about another really important term and concept that we discuss a lot when we're talking about individuals with disabilities and thinking about creating a more inclusive environment, and that is the term of ableism. So the teacher in me, because I asked you to pop into the chat what you thought neurodiversity meant, I'm going to ask you to do the same thing now for ableism. So I'm going to go silent for a moment and ask you to pop in the chat. What do you think of, what is your current working definition of when it comes to ableism? Well, I'm glad you're here so I can tell you more about it. Oh boy, good. Some new learning tonight. All right, well, keep them coming if you have thoughts, but I think it's time to jump right in. So ableism is essentially the discrimination or social prejudice of individuals with disabilities. So the way that you can think about it is that ableism is to disability the way racism is to race, right? I know that's kind of an extreme example, but that's essentially what it is. It's discrimination and social prejudice to people with individuals with disabilities. And really the root of ableism or an ableistic perspective is really from that medical model that I talked about, which is viewing people with disabilities as individuals that are in need of fixing and or are not equal to those members of society who do not have disabilities. So I'm just going to reiterate that again while I'm on this slide. So that ableism or an ableistic kind of view or perspective on the world is essentially discrimination or a social prejudice about people with disabilities. And that it really stems from that medical model where we view people with disabilities as individuals who have something wrong with them, and that our job as society is to fix them so they can fit into the structures and systems that are already in place. So this is a cartoon that I like. It's a little blurry, so I'll read what it says. But it starts with the person over here in the red hat in the wheelchair. And the individual is saying, could you please shovel the ramp? Okay, so here's the ramp with the snow on it. And the gentleman here with the green hat replies to that by saying, all these other kids down here are waiting to use the stairs. When I get through shoveling them off, then I will clear the ramp for you. And the response from the individual in the wheelchair to this somewhat kind of ableistic perspective here is, but if you shovel the ramp, we can all get in. And this kind of goes to this idea of, rather than viewing the person with the disability as the problem, how can we view the accommodations that we have in place for people with disabilities as an opportunity to actually support everybody? And for those who work in schools, we talk a lot about this, UDL is the acronym, Universal Design for Learning, right? Which is when we fix one thing, when we tweak or modify or adjust something to be a little more accessible, a little more inclusive, and a little more equitable for maybe one or two people, it actually inherently supports everybody. The other example of universal design for learning that I really like is, you know, when you're walking on a sidewalk and then the sidewalk kind of dips down to a crosswalk, right? And, you know, at first that was a part of ADA, Americans with Disabilities Act, right? For individuals with mobility challenges. But in fact, taking out that step and making it gradually go down into the crosswalk helps older people. It helps people who are pushing strollers or baby carriages. It helps little kids who are learning to walk, that you know, few inches seemed like a big leap. That there's lots and lots of different ways in which that one modification that was done to support individuals with mobility challenges actually helps all people in our entire society. So one of the examples I really like to show of ableism and kind of an ableistic perspective is a short video clip from the show Speechless, which was on ABC maybe 2 years ago. If you haven't seen it, I would highly recommend it. But this is a short clip where the main character's mother is talking to the school principal about how her son with cerebral palsy is to enter the school building.
Let's go to school, shall we? Where's the wheelchair ramp?
A garbage ramp?
It's not just a garbage ramp.
No, it's a garbage and my son ramp.
Okay, crash course in basic human dignity. Let's play a little game I like to call trash or person. Are you Dr. Miller? Trash? Are you a person?
You're a person, Dr. Miller.
Of course I am. Of course you're a person.
Oh, doctor.
But I think even in those 25 seconds, it's such a great example of kind of ableism and how, you know, the way that they solved the problem at the school for the son that uses the wheelchair was to have this student enter the back of the school where the deliveries are entered for the school cafeteria, where they take the trash out.
Let's go to
When we think about ableism, we can divide ableism up into two different kinds. There's unintentional ableism, and there's intentional ableism. So with unintentional ableism, that may be our actions when we help someone with a disability without their permission. If we see someone with a disability and we go up and help them, that's unintentional ableism, because what we're saying is we see you as someone who is unable to do something, and we're just going to intervene and help you without asking your permission to do so. So again, it's unintentional because it may seem like we're just doing the right thing, but in turn, it could be viewed as kind of an ableistic perspective or response. Another form of unintentional ableism is using the R word or other words or terminologies related to disabilities in a joking manner. We see this a lot in movies and in media where they throw the R word around a lot. You see this a lot in middle schools and high schools where, you know, kids make comments. I know in some middle schools and high schools, it's common for kids to, you know, make reference to whatever the room number is where maybe students on IEPs go to, right? Oh, you're in room, you know, 24 or whatever it is. Another form of unintentional ableism is lack of disability representation in mainstream media, whether that's music, whether that's TV, whether that's movies. Again, it might not be intentional that we're not including people with disabilities in this. It's just part of our system. So there's a whole host of things that within our society, we do or we support that is in form ableistic, but is often unintentional and we don't realize it. When we think about, and actually I'll go back and just say, I think in that short video clip, I think the principal was really caught off guard because I think what she was experiencing was unintentional ableism, right? She didn't think about it as ableistic using that ramp, but it was. When we think of intentional ableism, you can probably assume it's the opposite of unintentional, right? So when we think of intentional ableism, it's intentionally making fun of, teasing, bullying, putting down individuals with disabilities. The next bullet point I think is really important. It is forced integration and or segregation, right? Oftentimes, and anyone on here who's worked with me in the schools has probably heard me talk a lot about forced inclusion, right? Will we force things to happen, rather than building authentically inclusive environments for individuals and students, right? So forced integration can just be as detrimental and can just be as intentional as forced segregation. So rather than forcing things to come together, how can we work together collaboratively, think about long-term change, sustainable change, to build and cultivate more authentic, inclusive, and equitable environments for both individuals with and without disabilities, both individuals who might be defined as neurodiverse as well as neurotypical. Intentional ableism also refers to requirements that may exclude those with disabilities. So when we think about our schools, when we think about our structures and societies, there are requirements that are put in place. There are policies, there are rules, there are benchmarks, there are expectations that do inherently exclude individuals with disabilities. And that would be a form of intentional ableism or an intentional ableistic perspective. So how do we avoid ableism, right? So there's a few things that we can do to be mindful of avoiding ableism. One, we need to be aware of our own unintentional ableism. And I think that's really, really, really key, right? As individuals, we all have implicit biases, right, against different types of people. And so by taking this opportunity and for being here tonight and learning more about ableism, you can hopefully be more aware of your own unintentional ableism and hopefully be more aware of the people that you surround yourself with and how you can help them be more aware of their unintentional ableism or unintentional ableistic, statements or perspectives or actions. Believe people, right? When we talk and we engage with people with disabilities, if someone shares with us they have a disability, believe them, right? On the previous slides where we talked about neurodiversity, neurodiversity is mostly invisible. It's about how our brains work. It's not obvious when you just look at somebody. Take the time to get to know people and believe what they say. Don't assume, ask. So again, that kind of goes back to that first bullet point under unintentional ableism about helping someone with a disability without asking for their permission to help them. Don't assume someone can't. Don't assume someone wants your support in a certain situation. Ask them, believe them. Hopefully tonight, you've learned some new things that you can use to educate others about ableism. Like any type of social movement, like any type of social prejudice or discrimination, we need to teach other people about it and make others aware. A couple other things you can do is follow disability advocates on social media. Learn more about the disability community, learn more about the perspectives and life experiences of various people who live with disabilities. And push for greater accessibility within your communities, whether that's your workplace, whether that's the school you send your children to, whether that's your neighborhood, whether that's your church or your synagogue, your community center. Really think about these concepts and push towards greater accessibility. So what I'd like to do now is we're going to actually pause the screen recording in just a moment and open it up to a brief discussion. And there's 3 guiding questions that I put here on the screen that I think we can use to guide our discussion. And we'll be dropping those in the chat in just a moment because I'll stop the screen share. The first question to think about is, how does an understanding of ableism and neurodiversity help drive inclusion forward, right? So much of tonight's presentation was really unpacking, defining, and redefining these 2 terms. How does taking the time to define these terms help us move inclusive practice forward. I'd be curious from, we're from, we may be from different parts of Marin County on this conversation tonight. And I'm curious to explore a little bit more with you all as participants of what misconceptions about disabilities you still feel are prevalent in your individual community and or society at large. And lastly, how does a mindset around disabilities impact personal, both inclusive and exclusive behavior of individuals with disabilities? So thank you everybody for your thoughts and comments and participation, however you chose to participate. That was a great discussion. And again, hopefully not the end, but rather just the beginning. So want to learn more, we have put together a variety of additional resources that will be shared with you after this webinar. It'll be shared with you to your email address that you use to register through Eventbrite. We have some resources from understood.org. We have resources from a website called stopableism.org. There's a series of TED Talks and other newsworthy articles that will all be shared with you. And again, obviously there's a lot more we could talk about tonight. This was really just the tip of the iceberg. Neurodiversity and ableism are very complicated, deep concepts, but really are vital in thinking about transformative practice and thinking about moving the needle to a more inclusive Marin County and a more inclusive world altogether. So tonight's presentation is part 2 of a 5-part series that Dedication to Special Education has partnered with Marin County Office of Ed and Changing Perspectives to make it available to you. All of the recordings of these workshops will be made available. So the first workshop as well as this one. So if you had friends or families or parents you stopped and talked with today who maybe couldn't make tonight's presentation, we do encourage you to send them to the Dedication to Special Education website and have them watch the recording. The next, we're going to take a little bit of a break in January for holidays and kind of getting back in the routine of things. But on February 10th, our next Marin County Inclusion Inspiration Series, I'm really excited for. I'm actually not going to do all the talking that time, which will be fun, but rather I'm going to be kind of the MC and facilitate a panel discussion with a variety of inclusive leaders throughout the Marin County region. So we're going to hear from them, gain their perspective, what they see as best practices for inclusion, and also what's already happening. I think it's really easy in these conversations to really focus on what isn't working, but we want to take a moment to really celebrate what is working. In March, we hope you'll all join us for the screening of a film called The R Word. Again, there's more information about all of these presentations and you can register for them on the Dedication to Special Education website. But we're really excited to be able to share this independent film that's been shared at a variety of film festivals across the country, really looking into the history of the R Word and really the role that the R Word plays in maybe posing a barrier for more inclusive communities. And then lastly, at the end of the school year, we'll wrap up on May 12th with a presentation really focusing on a culmination of the previous 4 workshops and really, setting the stage for, so what is the vision moving forward? We've spent this year engaging in these virtual educational opportunities, and how can we then take that new knowledge, those conversations and those new resources and really think about what can we do to work together to make Marin County a more inclusive place for students and individuals with disabilities. So again, we hope that you'll share this recording. You'll encourage your friends and families to attend future workshops and replay this recording as well. So with that, we are at right around 7:30, and I know it is a Thursday night, and folks may have dinner to make or kids to put to bed, etc. Kristen, do you have any closing remarks?
No, I just want to thank everybody for joining us this evening. And I'm going to go ahead when you're ready, Sam, and I'm going to do the